Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rewind, our spin-off series where we take a deep dive back into a movie from our childhoods and talk about some behind-the-scenes stuff as well as our thoughts on the movie. This week, in celebration of the new Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny coming out, we decided to take a look back at Raiders of the Lost Ark. By the time you see this, we'll have seen Dial of Destiny. At this point, we have not seen it. Excited to get started and talk about one of my childhood favorites.
Yes. Yeah, this week, talking about Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, or just Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know, that was what it was called when it originally came out. It's an action-adventure film produced in 1981, directed by Steven Spielberg. Screenplay was by Spielberg and Lawrence Kasdan. But the story was from George Lucas and Philip Kaufman, and the film is set in 1936 and follows the adventures of our archaeologist, explorer Indiana Jones as he's searching for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. It stars Harrison Ford, Karen Allen, Paul Freeman, Ronald Lacey, John Rhys Davies. Am I saying that right?
John Rhys Davies,
John Rhys Davies, Denholm Elliott, and many others.
We have several sections we're going to talk about, ranging from like the characters to production behind the scenes, some controversy stuff, all of that, and every one of those sections will be linked down in the description. If you're interested in just one of them, you can jump to that. But starting off, so shortly after working on American Graffiti, George Lucas initially conceived of The Adventures of Indiana Smith as a B-movie throwback to the adventure serials he enjoyed growing up, like Buck Rogers and The Legend of Zorro. Indy being named after the dog, a joke that comes up in Indiana Jones: The Last Crusade. That was, funnily enough, part of the initial idea. That was part of it from the start, and he was named after George Lucas's real-life Alaskan Malamute. So that's pretty fun. The Indiana Smith project, though, was shelved for some time when Lucas started working on Star Wars. He was trying to secure the rights to make Flash Gordon and couldn't get it, so he made Star Wars, and so Indiana Smith, soon to be Indiana Jones, was shelved for the time being. And our previous Rewind episode is actually on the Star Wars original trilogy, so go check that out if you want to. So there were a couple other influences on this movie too. You want to talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Secret of the Incas. It's a 1954 film, very low budget adventure film. If you watch that film, I've never seen it. I don't know if you have, but the hero looks just like Indiana Jones. And there's like other small indie-like moments. I can't remember all of them exactly, but you know, it's like kind of that charismatic, like swagger, the swashbuckling kind of hero. Bigger influence than some of these other ones, but you know, I think you can see. I haven't seen it, but Lawrence of Arabia, I know that
I have seen it, yeah.
There's some of that influence in this film as well. And then some of these other ones, like you talked about, Zorro Rides Again, 1937 film. There was another Zorro film that inspired this as well, but I remember reading a quote from Lucas, I believe, where he was particularly inspired by like this one scene where Zorro's jumping from a horse onto like a train or some kind of moving vehicle, and that image kind of stuck in his mind, and that influenced some of this development for this film. But then also The Naked Jungle was another one, 1954. But I think one of the bigger influences as well, we talked about The Secret Life, or The Secret of the Incas, but Casablanca.
Yes, and I didn't see as much documentation on this specifically, but it's definitely influenced by it. I remember watching Casablanca in film school. You know those like really iconic double exposure sequences when Indy is traveling and he's flying on like a plane or on a boat or something like that, and you see the map with the line going through? That is straight out of the opening of Casablanca. And also, so there's that element of it, and Casablanca takes place in North Africa in a similar time period to the Indiana Jones movies, and the antagonists of that film are also the Nazis. And in general, just the atmosphere and look of Casablanca is very clearly an influence on the Indiana Jones series, and even the character of Rick himself, played by Humphrey Bogart, I think has a lot in common with Indy. He's kind of he's apolitical in a lot of sense, but ends up getting involved because of people he cares about, trying to escape the Nazis, and also the Nazis being evil. And apparently an initial concept for Indiana Jones was that he was going to be some sort of club owner, which is what Rick is in Casablanca. So I think there is a lot of Casablanca DNA in Indiana Jones. And as we mentioned earlier, Lucas had been working on this concept for a really long time at this point, but he would not do the movie without Steven Spielberg, and it might be a surprise from today's perspective, but studios were really hesitant to work with Spielberg at this point because I don't know if people knew this, but he had a reputation for coming in over schedule and over budget. So he was not really seen as totally reliable from a business point of view, from the studio's perspective. But even though his films had been great, but he was coming off of a financial dud as well in 1941, I believe it was. Lucas did eventually reach a compromise with Paramount and Michael Eisner, whose name might sound familiar from being an executive at Disney for a really long time. Yes. He gave them exclusive rights to the sequels and allowed for severe penalties if the movie went over budget or was late in any way. But regarding the quality of the film itself, I think it's just terrific. Like, pretty spectacular.
It belongs in a museum.
That belongs in a museum.
The film was nominated for 8 Academy Awards in 1982. It won 4 of them. It also won some Saturn Awards, and I think it won some BAFTAs too, but there were some other nominations and awards. So like, people across the industry obviously found this to be, you know, groundbreaking at the time. And yeah, in my opinion, I think this is like the ultimate action adventure film, and it's widely regarded to be perfect in a lot of senses. There are some flaws. There are like no bad scenes.
No, it's really great across the board. And I think there's a level of grit and realism to this movie, as well as Temple of Doom and Last Crusade, that really adds to the adventure element of this original trilogy. Like, everything is really dirty and lived in. People get muddy and blood everywhere, and they die in kind of horrific ways pretty consistently, often at Indy's hand. I think it's something that the 4th film really is lacking. It feels, I just watched it recently, I've rewatched all of them in prep for Dial of Destiny, and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I don't dislike it as much as I used to, but it just feels too clean in a lot of ways.
Sure, yeah.
A lot of people die, but it's in very cartoonish and safe ways, and I think a lot of that is just Spielberg and Lucas were much older and mature people when they made it, but there is a loss of like texture in that one that this movie really excels at, you know?
Yeah. You're saying it feels real. It feels kind of grounded in reality, and like the antagonists you hate because they're Nazis.
They're Nazis. They're really bad.
It's very easy to hate the villain here. They're not sympathetic at all. To me, this feels like a very black and white beginning for Indiana Jones of just here's evil, here's good. Yeah. That just feels like the main theme here of just kind of like good versus evil. Feels very black and white to me. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and also you have elements of like the divine and ideas that there are certain things that human beings are not meant to deal in, you know? And I think we'll talk about that more a little bit later as well, but I think that's a really heavy element in both this and The Last Crusade. But there are so many iconic scenes in this movie as well. The boulder sequence early on from the opening in Peru, that the prop for that boulder was 22 feet in diameter and weighed about 500 pounds. And Ford did a lot of his own stunts in this movie. So there's like real, that's another thing. It's like there's real danger when stunts are done tactically. And they are in this movie.
That whole sequence is iconic. And the opening of the Ark, later in the film, that is just iconic, just how all the Nazis die, how he's tied up on the stake with Marion. Like that whole scene is just like iconic, and I feel like it's been parodied so many times. Even like the RPG threat, which interestingly, I found this out during my research, that the model of rocket that he's using, that did not exist in World War II or before World War II. It should have been an anti-tank missile. That RPG model didn't exist until the 60s, but who cares?
Oh my God, imagine if that happened in a movie that came out today, the amount of people who would be picking it apart, just actuallying Steven Spielberg.
Oh yeah, well I saw another one too, another fact that like the MP40 as a weapon, I don't know if it was in production at the time of this movie when it was taking place in the 30s. It was more of like later on, but who cares?
Yeah, honestly, doesn't really matter.
It doesn't really matter because you're focusing on the scene, you're focusing on these iconic moments, like the standoff where it's like, you know this is an archaeological find. This is the greatest archaeological find of all time. Yeah. You can't blow it up. Like, you're not going to allow yourself.
Right, yeah, he calls his bluff because he knows this is too important for Indy, right? And it's just crazy how much happens in this movie. The pace is so quick but never feels rushed somehow. And the movie's only 2 hours, which doesn't seem that crazy, but so many movies like this now would be like 215 to 230, and it's just it moves so perfectly and is paced like very deliberately, you know?
Yeah, and like, yeah, it's just densely packed. But yeah, like, you know, what we said at the top, you know, this movie, I just thought it was interesting that it started off as Raiders of the Lost Ark. I remember watching that on my rewatch here. Like, it doesn't say Indiana Jones. And that's because later when they started making more movies, it was Indiana Jones, and so it was retroactively retitled.
Brand synergy.
Yeah.
Yes, but filming took place in La Rochelle, France, Tunisia, Hawaii, and Elstree Studios in England. Spielberg described the Tunisia shoot as like one of the worst he's ever done. One of the hardest because it was like 130 degrees outside, and over 150 crew members and cast members got amoebic dysentery from the local food. Spielberg himself, interestingly, was spared from this because he brought his own food from England. The issue led to the now, like, there is that iconic scene where the swordsman shows up, right? And Indy just casually pulls out a gun and shoots him. That was not the plan for this scene. There was going to be an elaborate sword fight, but Ford had dysentery and couldn't shoot for extended periods of time because he presumably had to go shit. So they changed the scene. He's like, can I just shoot him? And that's what they did. And it's incredible. Like, it's an amazing scene, but that is just, you know, I love those types of looks behind the curtain in film because a lot of these iconic moments are just because of circumstance on the day, you know?
Yeah, and that improvisation. But I think that minor change, too, works really well for the pacing and the tension building, too, because that's like during a whole scene where the love interest, Marion, you know, she's being like carried around in like a little basket, basically, like she's being kidnapped. Yeah. And there's a sense of urgency, and Indy having to do a whole choreographed fight scene. It's like,
he doesn't have time for
you don't have time for this, but if you just shoot him, it's like, okay, now you can go. Now you can go.
Well, and it really adds to his character too. It's like he's kind of fucking ruthless. Mm-hmm. Like, he will just kill you if you're in his way. He's like, you are inconveniencing me. I do not have time for you. I'm sorry, you're dead.
Yeah, it's just so great. But like you were saying, yeah, the film, even though a lot of this takes place in Cairo, those scenes were actually filmed in Tunisia, which was the same filming location as Star Wars. Yes. Different locations, but there was one area that was kind of an overlap that I found out. So that RPG negotiation scene was actually filmed in the same canyon that the R2-D2 scene from Star Wars, where he gets taken by the Jawas.
Okay, where he gets stunned.
Yes, and it's not exactly the same location, it's the same canyon.
Same canyon, okay.
Yeah, so they filmed in the same canyon there, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and on the note of Star Wars, you can actually see R2 and 3PO as one of the carvings in the Well of Souls. They're just, yeah, you know, there's all those designs of the column and the stuff. R2 and 3PO are in there as well. And just another, like, on the casting front, just to show you how many people were considered for the role of Indy, because Lucas didn't really want to use Ford at first because he didn't want to be seen as dependent on using the same actors over and over again, and he had already used Ford in American Graffiti and Star Wars. And also, he felt Ford was too big of a name. So some of the other people considered were Bill Murray, Nick Nolte, Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, Tom Matheson, Nick Mancuso, Peter Coyote, Jack Nicholson, Jeff Bridges, John Shea, Sam Elliott, Harry Hamlin, and Tom Selleck. Crazy list of people. And
so different with any of those guys.
Yeah, and Tom Selleck was specifically requested by Marshall Lucas, apparently, but he was contracted with CBS to do a pilot for Magnum P.I. And Lucas and Spielberg asked CBS, will you let him out of his contract 10 days early so he can do this? And CBS was like, oh shit, Selleck's in demand. And they put Magnum P.I. in the fast lane to a green light, the whole series, to keep Selleck locked in.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, just even having someone like Bill Murray, can you imagine?
I know.
Bill Murray, so weird.
The ones I can see working the most are like Sam Elliott and Jeff Bridges, I feel.
Yeah.
But without Ford, I don't think this series is even remotely what it is. But speaking of casting for Indiana Jones, let's talk about Indiana Jones himself.
Yes, let's talk about some characters. Yeah, Indiana Jones. Let's start off with the main one here. Yes, this guy. Yeah, he's a great protagonist.
Yeah, perfect for this type of movie. Like, he is a pulp adventure hero.
Well, yeah, and I think this role, it really worked well for Harrison Ford as an actor because he's a very charismatic, I would say down-to-earth kind of dude.
Yeah, he feels like a normal guy.
Yes, he feels authentic, he feels genuine, he feels like that carpentry work that he did worked wonders for him because he feels like a real dude in this film. So I mean, it just comes across well from this as like a once in a lifetime role for him, and he just kind of knocked it out of the park.
And he obviously loves his character and has been a great steward for Indy over the years. But I feel like Indy himself strikes this great balance because he's like a really gruff and capable, but he's also always on the back foot. And because he's up against forces that are just much more powerful and have a lot more resources than him in every movie, really. So it's like you get this like nice contrast where like he knows what he's doing and he's good at it, but he always is on his toes because he's fighting against such impossible odds and he's barely getting by. He gets beat up.
Yeah. Well, he loses a lot.
He loses a lot, and he always like barely skates by at the end just because of his like intelligence and wit. It would be very tempting, like if they were to make something in the vein of Indiana Jones today. It's like they would probably start really young, and like he doesn't really know what he's doing. And we have to see how he gets there. And in this, they don't do that. He's already at that point.
But like, he kind of has a James Bond aesthetic to him a little bit.
Bond was an influence, yes.
Yeah, that does come across. But and I don't mean like looking really dapper or anything like that. I meant more like he kind of lives this double life. He's very suave and he's experienced and he knows what he's doing. But like, I think some of that James Bond aesthetic also comes across in like the double life aesthetic thing,
right?
Which has always been a weird little sticking point for me. And it's fine. It works. It's whatever. But Indiana Jones, on the one hand, is a treasure hunter or a fortune finder, looking for these lost artifacts as an archaeologist. At the same time, he's in academia as an archaeology professor. He gives a lecture at the start of the film after our intro sequence with the boulder and everything. But he even provides, like, he's like, you guys need to do this homework. Like, he tells the class as they're leaving. But then he goes on like a week-long trip on this archaeology.
He's just gone all the time.
He's just gone like half the time. It's just like, how are you able to balance academia with this spontaneous archaeological adventures? It's like he definitely has a substitute. 90% of the year, that class is just like a freebie.
And that's why Indiana Jones only exists in the movies. Speaking of the Bond parallel, because apparently I think it was Lucas kind of pitched it to Spielberg as sort of a play on Bond or something like that. And the opening of Temple of Doom is a direct reference to the Sean Connery James Bond. In that club in Singapore, he has got the white tuxedo on, and they're at the table. I don't love Temple of Doom, but that opening scene in the club is so good. It's amazing. Moving beyond Indy, though, like he's an amazing protagonist, but I think his romance in this movie with Marion Ravenwood really works, and it is the best romantic pairing of the whole series, in my opinion. And a lot of that is just due to Karen Allen's performance and the sort of like feisty nature of Marion as a character.
Yes, she is by far the best love interest that he has. And I would say if she wasn't in this film, it would not have been as good.
No.
She is a great counterbalance to him. Like, they have this really good chemistry that's on screen. You can feel it. But yeah, she's just a really fun character overall.
She grew up and her father was someone who was very like Indy. Yes. I think she has a little bit of resentment for this whole world, but she's still interested and like pulled into it because she really does like it, but she doesn't like that she likes it,
Yeah, she's complicated.
But even from their first scene together, you can really feel that these two have a lot of history, and we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of that history because
we'll get to that.
Why, George? Why, Stephen? And I guess we're talking about that now. The age difference in the movie.
Yes.
In the present day of the story, Marion is supposed to be 25 and Indy is 37. And the movie talks about how they had a previous relationship. And if you do the math on when that previous relationship would have happened, because apparently Indy was in graduate school at the time under her father, Abner Ravenwood, Marion would have been 15.
It's not great.
No, it's gross.
It's not legal, George.
No.
It's not legal.
No, it's really bad.
We can't do that.
No, and we don't want to do that. And it really does. I am just choosing in my brain to ignore this piece of information whenever I watch these movies because it's fucking disgusting and it kind of compromises Indy's character a little bit. And apparently Lucasfilm retconned Marion's age to make her a little bit older, but for some reason they still kept her young enough to where she was still a minor in the previous relationship. Why'd you do that? Just change it more. What are you doing?
It was just a bad idea to have that in there. She should have been older. She should have been like a similar age to him of like early 30s.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like then you could have had
Or just like she can still be younger, but at least have her be of age. Like she's 20.
Exactly.
She's 20 or 19 or something. It's like still on the cusp, but like legally acceptable, you know?
Yes.
But that aside, Marion is a very fun character, and Karen Allen gives a really strong performance. And one thing I love is there's a great setup and reverse payoff with Marion and alcohol. Because our introduction to her character is her winning a drinking competition against someone by having enough shots to kill me, probably. So we know she can handle her liquor, right? And then when she's captured by the Nazis and she's in that scene with Belloc in the tent, they start drinking together. And they untie her, and you see her hide a knife, and you're like, oh, she's going to outdrink him and get out that way. You know, she's going to get him drunk, and then she's going to escape. It's obviously setting us up to think that, but then Belloc just, like, holds his own with her, and he reveals, like, this is my family label. I grew up drinking this. It's like, oh, no, he's out drinking you, and she gets drunk.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, she's met her match here unexpectedly, and I think that's really fun.
Love her character. She's just fantastic. And yeah, just don't even, when you're watching this movie, best practice, don't even think about the first relationship.
It never happened.
Never happened.
In black it's not real.
That's the best headcanon that you can have.
Yeah, and moving on to another character, sort of Sala, a great side character. John Rhys Davies is great, and he's just like, he's working on the excavation. Like, he was hired to dig on the excavation because he lives in Cairo, and that's his skill set. But I love that he and Indy seem to have known each other for a really long time. They have an established relationship. I feel like in a lot of movies made today, we would see them meet in this movie, and it would be the beginning of their relationship. But the Indiana Jones series opts for starring a character who's been on a lot of adventures already, yes. So we get this nice sense of history, and he has contacts and friends all around the world. And I think that's great for a series like this. Like, it adds texture and depth to these characters that, like, they have lived a life before we've caught up with them, you know?
Yeah, I love that they already kind of know each other. And I definitely didn't pick up on this when I was younger, that, you know, John Rhys Davies, obviously where we know him from too is Lord of the Rings as Gimli. Like, I didn't make that connection when I was younger, so finally made that connection on my rewatch recently. So, but, you know, obviously different time, 1980s. The casting choices of that time obviously were not as progressive as today. It is a little weird that they chose a white actor to play an Egyptian, but, you know, different times, and he still gave a great performance, I would say, so I'm not upset about that at all.
Yeah, and apparently it would have been even more strange because Danny DeVito was initially offered the role by Steven Spielberg, which would have been pretty wild. But let's transition and talk about some more villainous characters for a little bit. Yes. So let's start with René Emile Belloc. The foil, the archaeological foil to Indiana Jones. His darker half, I suppose. Delightfully slimy character played by Paul Freeman. And I love how the movie introduces him, right? It's the perfect antagonist introduction because it establishes both his personality and his relationship to Indy perfectly. It's like Indy, from the looks of it, does most of the archaeological work and research. He finds the artifact, and then at the last second, Belloc swoops in and steals it from him with force. Yeah. Usually like military force, right? That's established in the opening sequence, and then it's repeated with the Ark and the Well of Souls later on. It's a great villain introduction.
Oh, it's phenomenal. Like, he's obviously very, like, calculating. I think he appreciates archaeology in a similar vein as Indy, but you know, they have different benefactors and all that stuff. One of the things that I hated, especially on this rewatch, was just how he treats Marion as an object in this film. She has great agency, I would say, in this film, especially for the time. But like in this movie, he's like, she's mine. She is my possession.
Yeah, the way he talks about her is so gross.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like, when he's talking with the Nazis and stuff, he's like, she was mine, you shouldn't have thrown her in there. Or, like, when they're renegotiating, he's like, well, I need to take the girl. She's mine now. And it's like, it is so weird. But, like, I think the relationship that they build together makes him a little bit more sympathetic. Like, when They're sitting there in the tent drinking, and then the other Nazi guy comes in. I think that they both have very similar reactions.
Yeah, it humanizes him a little bit.
It does, yes,
He's
it does.
gross and like not chill at all, but it's like both he and Donovan like team up with the Nazis, but for their own ends, you know. And Belloc is very clearly interested in the archaeology, and he has his own motives for getting the Ark, but he's like sold his soul, you know. And I think there is that moment of realization in that scene where he's like, oh, I'm in too deep, and I can't deal with these people because they're the Nazis. Like they will kill whoever they want to.
Yeah.
But you know, he gets what he deserves.
He does, yeah. I don't have any sympathy for him. It would just humanize him for a second, barely. And great performance by Freeman. And I love that little bit during the RPG negotiation. A fly lands on his face.
Right.
And it kind of looks like it crawls into his mouth and he swallows it, which just kind of adds a little bit of an extra vile element to him. There's, I think the DVD, when it came out, like people could see that it flew away. I like the interpretation of it, him just eating it, you know.
On the version I watched on Disney Plus for rewatch, it looks like it does just go into his mouth, and there are behind the scenes rumors and stuff. It seems like people have settled on that it did fly into his mouth on one take, and he probably spat it out, but it was like a neat character moment, so they use so they cut it so it looks like it just goes in and stays there.
Smart, yeah.
Filmmaking, yay.
Good thinking, but we also have another Nazi. We have two Nazis, really, but Herman Dietrich, played by Wolf Kahler, I think. Okay. But I thought a neat note during the research that I found that his name actually means, Dietrich means skeleton key or ruler in English, which I just thought was kind of neat. But I thought he's a great antagonistic character, great performance of a shitty Nazi.
Yeah. Well, and we didn't put notes about him here, but like the big guy that Indy fights that gets chopped up by the plane propeller, that's a great fight scene, and that scene especially like taps into what I was talking about, grit and like realism. Like it's a brutal fight, and Indy is getting his shit rocked, and then the Nazi just gets ripped to shreds by a propeller. And it's off screen, but there's a lot of blood, you know.
Yeah, it's brutal.
It's good. But we have our last main villain is Major Arnold Tutt. What a menacing little asshole, you know. He's played so well by Ronald Lacey. He's able to make the guy really scary from the moment he's first introduced. You know, he's menacing, but the film reminds us that the Nazis were like really stupid too. Because they were, for the record. Like, think about it. Their country did not last that long because their leadership was full of clowns. They really remind us about how stupid the Nazis were because he reaches into a fire to grab a metal object. That's really dumb. Yeah.
Melts his hand.
I love he just starts like squealing and then runs outside and sticks his hand inside. It's so funny.
It's so cartoonish in a way there too. Like, especially with the sound effects, it's just like, it feels like this is a great comedic moment.
But it ties back into the plot later too, because they're using that burn to track down the Well of Souls, but it's not the whole thing because there's inscriptions on both sides, so they're digging in the wrong place.
They're digging in the wrong place.
The script is so tight in this movie, but this little fucker is a great villain.
Yeah, he's sadistic, he's resourceful, he's obviously cunning. He is scary. Yes. He doesn't do much in terms of like physical violence, or he never really feels like a physical threat, but like know that he's like okay with torture, that he's okay with these kind of like vile methods to get what he wants. We all wanted to see him die.
Yep, and he melts so much.
Yes, he melts a lot, and it's glorious. When we transition to some discussion on some of the controversies around this film.
And just discourses, things people have talked about this movie. Yes.
I guess the main controversy I think that I'll start off with is just the concept of fortune hunting or treasure hunting, especially in a modern context. Yes. Because when you boil his character down, you strip away everything, he's a grave robber. He's robbing these tombs, and he's selling the artifacts to museums and art collectors to make a profit. But obviously he's well-intentioned, we understand that, and when we're with him throughout the series, he's not really just like searching for like jewels and gems to sell. It's like he's looking for these incredible historic artifacts. The Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the Crystal Skull, like all these things, they're unparalleled. and they're incredibly culturally and historically significant. I think with Temple of Doom, I haven't watched it in forever, but those stones that he's like looking for,
he just gives it back to
he just gives them back.
He gives it back to the village that it was stolen from, and that is an element that I think we should mention. Is like it is like if Indy doesn't get the things he's seeking, like the Nazis get them. So there is that element. It's like it is a race against evil to like protect these artifacts, and the famous "it belongs in a museum." That is his motivation, and it is kind of pure, but it's like maybe they belong in museums owned by the culture for which the artifacts are from. Yep. But these movies were made years and years and years ago. Yeah. Don't be like the British Museum and just take everything that belongs to other people. But I think within the context of the framework of this series, it's not the worst thing, you know?
Well, yeah, he's not a colonizer. He's not exterminating native populations and plundering their cities for personal gain. Looking at you, British Museum, which right now, I looked this up before we hopped on, it has over 900 historic objects that are contested, but were stolen from native populations during their periods of colonization, like the Benin bronzes of the West African Kingdom of Benin. But there's so many others like that, and the British Museum is just like, well, we don't, like, they're just dragging their feet on returning these.
Well, didn't the museum director or somebody say, like, well, if we returned everything that was stolen during colonization, the British Museum would be empty? It's like, yeah. So what? It's not yours. It's not your shit. Like, give it back.
And yeah, I think you and we both watched Last Week Tonight. John Oliver did a great segment on that, where people from Benin, like that country, have to go to Britain to see these artifacts that are from their country. Like, how fucked up is that? Like,
yeah, and that's the defense the British Museum likes to use. Like, oh, we're preserving them for people to see. It's like, well, the people from the country these things are from have to be able to afford to get to you across the world from wherever they are and get access to the museum, and then they have to follow your rules to interact with artifacts from their culture that you stole. So, yeah.
Not great, so we just wanted to throw that in there.
He just offers a good chance to bring up this real-world topic, which is what we do on our show a lot.
We like to do that when we can. Yeah. Welcome to the podcast.
But a goofier controversy that I didn't know about until recently, but you put in here, is regarding the submarine sequence.
Yes, we get this good arc throughout the film where Indy and Marion, they get the arc and they're on a ship back to, I can't even remember where they're going, but just going back home. They it looks like they won, but the Nazis catch up to them in a U-boat. They get raided. They take the arc back
and Marion.
Yeah. But then Indy, he swims over to the submarine, and the next scene basically is that map transition again, and then all of a sudden they're back in...
It's an island off the coast of Greece.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I forgot where that was. So the controversy has always kind of been, how did Indy get there? It's a submarine U-boat. Like, so there have been a lot of different theories about how he got there. Apparently there's a deleted scene that shows...
I've seen it.
Oh, you have? Okay. So, do you want to explain it?
Yeah, he just sits on the top.
So I guess it never submerged.
It never fully submerges, and apparently a lot of submarines will do that sometimes. Like, they won't fully submerge, I guess. So it's like he's just holding onto the periscope, I think.
Yeah, the periscope.
And just sitting on the top.
It's very funny, and I guess like it makes sense during peacetime too, because
or in like non-hostile waters, I guess.
Yeah, so you're like, well, we don't need to dive; we can just kind of coast along the surface. So, but yeah, I thought that was funny too, because I recently learned about that too. I didn't know that was such a big topic of discourse.
Yeah, and one thing I want to talk about in terms of discourse is like there's always talk online about how Indy is like pointless in the plot of this movie, how he has no effect or changes on the story or plot. First off, I think he does. You can argue that the Nazis eventually would have found the Well of Souls and the Ark within it, right? Because it's not that far from where they're digging, but they were digging in the wrong place.
They're digging in the wrong place.
And Indy is the one who finds and unearths the Ark. And, of course, Belloc shows up at the last second to steal it out from under him. But, like, whether or not they would have found it eventually doesn't really matter, because Indy's acumen and work is the reason they find it in the movie. So he does directly affect the plot. And more importantly, though, who cares? Whether or not Indy has an effect on the plot is not the important part. The important part is, like, the effect the Ark has on him as a character. You know, I can see the argument that you want your main character's actions to drive the plot forward so that they're not a passive protagonist. But I think Indy does drive the plot quite a lot, and he is active. He's making decisions, he's going places, he's looking for things. Whether or not he affects the outcome of the Nazis finding the Ark and dying doesn't really matter in terms of it, because he is active and he's driving the main story beats throughout the movie. So let's talk about the tone of the movie a little bit, because it is a very funny movie.
Yeah.
But it balances it with a lot of serious moments as well. In terms of jokes, there is a gag where Tot, the Nazi guy, it's when Marion's captured. And he pulls out what looks like nunchucks or something, like he's about to torture her, and then he folds it into a coat hanger. And it's so funny. And it's also apparently a recycled gag from Spielberg's film 1941 from a few years earlier. It's such a funny joke, and it's not dwelled on at all. I love it.
It's quick, and it's good to break the tension. You know, you're like, oh, what's this guy gonna do? And then all of a sudden, it's undercut by this joke, and it's great because it's like, what is this menacing object that he has? Oh, it has a practical function to not get my jacket dirty. It's
you know what it reminds me of, and I bet this was a reference to this, is in The Last Jedi, when that thing is coming down and then it's revealed to be a clothes iron.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Iron.
It is an iron. Yes. It's like a press. Yeah.
It's a press. It's steam press.
But yeah, there's so many great comedic moments in this movie. Like every time I laugh out loud when I think of it, and when I watch it too, because it's just so well timed. Like it's the chase sequence for the Ark. Indy gets on the truck. He's like, he's chasing with the horse, and then he gets on the truck, and he's driving the Nazis off the road. He's punching people and stuff like that. And then there's this one scene where he's driving the truck, and this little motorcycle with the passenger carriage on the side comes up on his left, and he can see it so clearly. Yeah. And you don't see him hit it with the truck. It's just him. He's waiting for the perfect moment, then goes boop, just runs him off the road.
It's so good.
Great, I love that. Or like we already talked about with Marion and her drinking skills. He or what she does with her character introduction, drinks the other guy under the table and he just falls over, like trying to keep pace. I thought that was really great. Or the scene in the with the swordsman that we already talked about. Yes. I think that's great. They're on the
oh my god
ship with the Ark, coming back home. Indy's taking off his clothes and like looking at like
he's all bruised and like beat up.
He's been shot, like he's been cut, all this stuff, and like he's just like obviously in so much pain and he's sore. And then Marion's on the other side of the mirror that he's looking in. She flips it over.
What'd you say?
I'd forgotten about this and I laughed so hard.
It's so funny. Clocks him and she's like, "Did you say something?"
Yeah.
So funny. Or like in that same kind of scene, they're having this romantic moment, and they finally kiss, and then Indy falls asleep because he's so exhausted,
so tired. Yeah,
that's so great. Or all the women during his lecture, just
college class,
swooning over him.
They're like, "I love you" on the eyelids.
Absurd, but good moment of humor. And there's so many of those in the movie. And then in between those funny moments, we have these, albeit very shocking, kind of occasional horror moments where all of a sudden it's like, oh, that scared me. That's spooky. I remember these as I was a kid of being like, that was a little too intense for me. But
we get Marion's death fake out for one. You have a couple other ones here.
Yeah. A lot of these sometimes do have to do with Marion. Unfortunately, she gets a lot of these, but like where they escape from the Tanis, right? Or not Tanis, is it? Or was that? It was just a crypt. Wherever they find the Ark.
It's the well of souls.
The well of souls. Thank you. That's what I meant to say. The well of souls. They're escaping from it. Indy breaks them out. They kind of just stumble into just like this, just big crypt of skeletons. Yeah. And she's just rolling around in it for a second, and it's just like, oh my god. Jones pulls her out. Like,
right.
It's terrifying.
It's a very like clear moment of subjective filmmaking too, because you see like how all the bodies are laid out, and it's like it's nothing like Marion is experiencing it earlier in the scene. So it's like that's not a literal thing. She's just panicking, and it feels like, oh, they're everywhere, but it's really not like that. On the note of the snakes, there were like 7,000 snakes or something like that.
So many snakes.
Apparently, they had 3,000 or 4,000, and Spielberg's like, I can't get a wide shot because there just aren't enough snakes. Yeah. And they needed to get more anti-venom at one point too.
Oh gosh, yeah, jeez. Yeah. But yeah, the snakes, that's terrifying. Or there's like numerous points in the intro sequence too. We've talked about some of the blood, guts, and gore in this movie, but like that are just like creepy crawly. Like he's walking through the tomb, and the guy's he's like, "Senor, like you're back." And there's tarantulas, and then the other guy turns around, and his back has even more tarantulas crawling all over him. Or like the dead bodies from the spikes that pop out of the wall. He gets to see the other treasure hunter, and then we get to see the guide later just freshly impaled. It's like, oh, those are grotesque. So yeah, there's some great balancing moments in this film between comedy and also very serious dramatic moments.
Right. On the note of like balancing tone so well, I love that the camera work, dialogue, and music all treat the arc and the search for it with this like extreme gravitas. There's no bathos undercutting like the importance of what this thing is, right? No humor, no quipping, anything like that, which a lot of movies feel the temptation to do. And even Indy, who doesn't really believe in any of this stuff at first, he treats it completely seriously because it's like a very significant historical artifact. He has no spiritual connection to it, but it is a big deal, and he treats it as such. And Williams' music helps add a tremendous element to this as well. The music is very somber and sort of epic when the arc is involved. And there are a lot of fun flares to the soundtrack, right? But when it comes to the arc, it's very serious.
Yes.
And I think it's important for us to be invested in him getting this thing and the Nazis not getting it. You can't treat it as trivial. It needs to be this important thing.
Absolutely. And yeah, Williams he just crushes it here. Without his music, the film would have been completely different.
Of course, as we always talk about with John Williams, like one of the most legendary composers ever. But there have been some fun adaptations of this movie. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because there's several, it seems like.
Yeah, it was interesting just kind of looking this up and doing research on this, because there was actually, before the movie was even released, like 2 months prior to it, a Raiders of the Lost Ark novelization was released by Campbell Black. I'm not entirely clear on the entire backstory of why it was created. I think just to get the name out there.
They used to do that a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure that, I mean, they did it with Star Wars and so many other things, but yeah, there was a novelization of it. It made some very, so that makes it actually technically the first Indiana Jones product ever released.
That's crazy, yeah.
It was a book, not a movie. Get your facts straight. But there's all the differences between the book and the movie are mostly minor, just kind of like small little things of like, oh, he rode in the car, or this car, or like this thing happened here, or these two characters were the same one, or they were different characters. So very kind of small things like that.
Okay.
There was one thing that I thought was actually more interesting. We already talked about in the novelization. They makes it very clear that Billock uses Toph's handprint, the melted hand, to create the mold for the headpiece. They make that very explicit in the book. That wasn't made explicitly in the movie. One of the other things that I thought was interesting too, between the differences, was that the depiction of Indy in the book is a lot more melancholic. He's a little bit more serious, which I think is a little bit different from Harrison Ford's depiction on screen. And so the author made that change because he felt that the depiction in the screenplay of the character was a little bit too comic booky, that he was just a little shallow, he acted impulsively, and it's like, I get that. So as an author, I might make that same change. But yeah, I've never read that novel, but I might be interested to read that and to see how it compares to the movie. And I found this out too during the research, that never had the Atari. I've never played the Atari.
Before our time.
Way before our time, but there was a video game adaptation for the Atari 2600 console.
That's fun.
I have no idea if it was a good game or not, but I assume that it was fun at the time.
Probably. Yeah, but we have a couple more things that are just sort of miscellaneous or final thoughts that we want to put together. So you mentioned here, Alfred Molina, Doc Ock himself, is in this movie.
I was so surprised by this. Like, I recognized the name in the opening credits, and then him. He's the guide.
The beginning, yeah.
Beginning for the Inca run. What the fuck? Like that, I did not put two and two together when I was younger, or even like.
Oh, I mean, yeah, yeah, we were little.
Yeah. I thought that was a great depiction of his character. You know, he eventually became Doc Ock, and he's still very active today. In some cinema, he was broke at the time apparently when he had this role. He was 28 years old, and he was just starting a family, and you know, he was just trying to scrape by. And this was just one of his first major roles, I would say. And on this rewatch, when I was watching just the credits roll, because I had noticed those two things on this watch. I was like, who else? Yeah. Which other ones am I going to pull out? And then I saw Kathleen Kennedy, saw you in the credits as the assistant to Mr. Spielberg.
Yep. I mean, she's been behind the scenes at Lucasfilm for like the whole time. That's why I think all those like Kathleen Kennedy ruined Star Wars. I think all those people are just so like stupid because it's like, oh, you know, she's been there the whole fucking time. Legendary Hollywood producer. I just think it's funny. It's like, so most of the things you probably love, she had a hand in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she's been just integral in so many things. But
yeah. And one thing that I didn't really think about much as a kid, and I forgot until this recent viewing, is just how close Indy's dig site is to the rest of the excavation. Yeah. And, like, of course it is, right? It makes sense geographically because, you know, it's part of the same city and all that. But, like, no wonder they got caught. Yeah. I'm surprised they didn't get caught sooner because it's right in the middle of Belloc's excavation. I thought it was so funny. Like,
they're like creeping up over, and then they're like, okay, can we dig here?
Yeah. And then they stop creeping, and Indy's just like pacing back and forth as the sun sets. Great shot, by the way, but it's like, someone's gonna see you, man.
Yeah, like, you guys aren't being very sneaky about this anymore. Yeah. One thing too that I wanted to talk about too has always been a sticking point for me with this film. How did Indiana Jones know to close his eyes when the Ark was opened? Like, what was the reasoning for that? The film provides no explanation for that. Unfortunately, it had to come from the book adaptation. Yeah. So I found this out that, so Salah, he introduced Indy to Imam, who was able to translate the writing on the Staff of Ra fragment for them, which helps them find the real location of the Ark. In the novelization, there's a little bit more dialogue and conversation where Amon warns Indy about the fatal consequences of opening the Ark of the Covenant. Right. He tells him that, you know, even simply looking upon the holy power of the Ark of the Covenant will result in death and destruction. And in the novelization, Indy remembers that note when they're during that final climax, and that's why he yells it. So that is the reasoning, but it's like, that is not provided in the film clearly.
Yeah, I always just interpret it as like instinct, and Indy kind of gets the feeling it's like you need to be humble in the face of God, right? So he just like shields himself from it. But I love that this element of the climax exists because Sala says earlier in the film about the Ark when Indy, it's like at the first scene with him, and he's like, it was something man was not meant to disturb. Death has always surrounded it. It is not of this earth. And I think that's what separates like Indy from the villainous Nazis, amongst other things, of course. But like, is that they view themselves as worthy of dealing with this power, and it also plays with like Hitler's real world obsession with the occult and things like that. He viewed these things as important and part of his empire, right? Mm-hmm. And so the Nazis probably thought that they were deserving of this divine power. Of course, they were not. It plays with the idea that like something of this level of divine importance is not meant to be trifled with, and certainly not to be used to your own ends, right? Mm-hmm. And anyone who attempts something like that will be punished, and they punished they are.
Yeah, they get
fucking owned.
Yeah, it is such a satisfying climax to the story, and it works very well. But yeah, just the eyes being closed, it's like, I get it. It works. It's just one of those small little nitpicky details, because honestly, there's not too much about this film that
it's near perfect.
You know, it is nearly perfect. Like we were saying earlier, like we grew up with this film, we love it, and we really wanted to talk about it.
Yeah. On that note, we're done talking about this. Look forward to our podcast episode on Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny the week after the film releases. Excited to see that. I've enjoyed rewatching all of these, enjoyed this conversation. We will do more rewinds in the future, and this is not a Lucasfilm exclusive series, even though it may look like that at this point. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you liked it, like and subscribe to this channel. You can also subscribe to our main podcast channel, just called Play, Pause, Rewind. We're also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and TikTok and Instagram and Twitter if you care about those. But thank you all so much. Enjoy the new Indiana Jones movie, and we will see you at our review.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.